Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, Tony Blair has said Labour would annihilate the Conservative Party were it to take an opposing stance on Brexit. Mr Blair says Jeremy Corbyn isn't doing enough to scrutinise the deal and is therefore aiding a Tory-designed exit from the EU. Well, Sky's Robert Nisbet sat down with the former Prime Minister to discuss his party's position.
I understand, actually, the politics of this, which is to say, look, a substantial number of Labour voters voted leave, we just got to go ahead with it. But here's what I think, why I think this position is mistaken. If Labour came to power, I mean, he's talked about coming to power and being Prime Minister this year, supposing that happens for whatever reason, Labour's going to be in exactly the same position as the Tories. Brexit's going to be the dominant issue. Brexit will carry on being the dominant issue for years to come. You know, we're dealing with this health service crisis at the moment. The Prime Minister can't think about that. The Chancellor can't think about that. They've got to think about Brexit. And you know, if Labour gets itself into the position of where it's saying me too on Brexit, then it's going to find exactly the same problems. So what I'm saying to the Labour Party is far better, since we in the Labour Party don't really believe Brexit's the answer to the country's problems, say it. Be open with people and say, you know, make this Brexit what it really is, which is a Tory Brexit in the end. And deal then with people's anxieties, whether over immigration or jobs or inequality or living standards, by policies that address those questions, which Brexit in the end doesn't really do.
Why do you think a member of the shadow cabinet is calling your intervention today utterly unhelpful?
Well, because what they think is that they're the smartest
When you say they,
thing,
you mean?
The Labour Party leadership. What they think is that the smartest thing to do is for Labour to carry on saying, well, we're in favour of Brexit too, and then essentially, when the government comes out with its deal, say, well, we will get a better deal. I tell you, when they get to that point, they're going to find it very difficult. It's far better to go onto the high ground, say what we really think, and give some leadership to our people. You know, I understand why there are people in Labour seats who felt, you know, there was no listening to them, people weren't paying attention to their anxieties and their concerns and their worries, and so that was a major part behind the June 2016 referendum decision. You've got to address those concerns. I'm in no doubt about that at all. But the reality is, Brexit is going to make their position worse. It's going to put up the standard of living because of the fall in the currency. It's going to reduce growth, and therefore there are fewer jobs and less money to go around. And on the health service, you can see then a lot of them will have voted on the basis, well, we're going to get more money for the health service. But we haven't. We've actually got less. So I think it would be a far stronger position for the Labour Party to be in, to say what it actually thinks. And I think the vast majority of Labour members think that Brexit is not the answer to the country's problems. Say what we think, show some leadership, and then, you know, I could see a situation where the Labour Party would annihilate the Tories if it went to the high ground, because it would also go right back into the fundamental division in the Tory party over the future of the country. So I think it would be it would just be a much more powerful political position. So that's...
So when you say annihilate, I mean, you mean government for decades to come?
Well, I think what it would do is you would have a really powerful message for the country, because at the moment, look, actually, we very rarely raise Brexit at Prime Minister's questions. And yet it's the dominant issue of the day. So why do we do that? It's because we don't really want to get into a fight on Brexit. We want to fight on these other issues. But the problem with that is that it is Brexit that makes you less capable of dealing with these other issues. And so if you, for example, want to deal with the immigration question, which I think was a big, big part of the referendum vote, then deal with it. Actually deal with the immigration issues, which you can do, by the way, through strong policy if you want to do so.
Former Prime Minister there in conversation with our senior political correspondent Robert Nisbet, who joins us now. Robert, what should we take away from that conversation?
Well, there's a number of, I think, interesting elements there. I think potentially it's really the political element here, that in the past Tony Blair has criticised Jeremy Corbyn for being too ideologically rigid. And here we have Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour leadership taking what some may call a more nuanced position on Brexit, and he's criticising them for doing that. And what I said to him is, well, isn't Jeremy Corbyn just playing proper politics, serious politics, by trying to keep both wings of the party together? And he, in effect, was saying that Brexit is much more important than that. And I think you got the thinly veiled criticism there of Jeremy Corbyn saying that he can't understand why we, and by we he means the Labour leadership, isn't going in much harder on Brexit in question time. And I think there may be some moderate MPs on the backbenches in the Labour Party who probably feel exactly the same thing. But I think the issue here is that Tony Blair still remains such a divisive figure, not just within the Labour Party, but the country. Is another intervention on Brexit such as this actually helpful? I quoted there a shadow minister saying that it was utterly unhelpful, that Tony Blair should actually stay out of this discussion, but clearly the former Prime Minister feels that he still has a lot to give. I suggested to him that this is just more talk. This paper that he's produced, well, obviously something he feels passionately about, isn't actually a strategy to try to stop Brexit. And he said that the conversation is what is necessary this year to try to convince the Labour leadership that they need to take the position of being the rethink party of Brexit, rather than just timidly, as he put it, going along with the government stance.
Robert, for now, thanks very much indeed. Let's stay in Westminster. Let's go to the Labour MP, Mary Cray. Mary Cray, very good afternoon to you. Is Mr Blair's intervention something you welcome, and do you welcome the substance of what he had to say?
I welcome his intervention. I agree with the substance, and I believe that he's right. He's right to say that people were promised extra money for the NHS and strong controls on immigration. What we've seen from the government is no extra money for the NHS, £350 million for the whole of the winter, when we were promised £350 million a week. And what people are seeing is, with the pound devalued, with that feeding through into inflation, and with pay falling behind prices, a huge and continuing squeeze on their families' incomes, at the same time as their public services, their schools are falling apart, their hospitals are in crisis, and as they're watching their elderly relatives suffering on trolleys and waiting in ambulance for the care that they need and deserve and have paid for, people are getting more and more frustrated with the government. I'm afraid it's not enough for the Prime Minister to just turn up and say she's sorry. She is responsible for this mess.
Other people will point to economic measures like employment, record high, the stock market, record high. And just to pick up something that Mr Blair had to say there in that interview with Robert Nisbet, he said the vast majority of Labour MPs, he may be thinking of you and others on the backbenches, the vast majority of Labour MPs think Brexit is not the answer to the country's problems. That being so, why did 7 out of 10 Labour constituencies vote for Brexit?
700, sorry, I misheard you.
7 out of 10 Labour constituencies voted for Brexit. But the MPs don't believe that, do they?
No, we as a party campaigned against Brexit. That was our position. And I personally voted against triggering Article 50. I thought it was the wrong time. The election that then was called 4 short weeks later took 12 weeks out of the negotiating time that the Prime Minister had, and left her in an even weaker position amongst her own party. So I've been quite consistent that I think Brexit will make our country poorer.
That's not in question, though, Mary Cray. That's your consistency is not in question. What's in question is the disconnect between Labour MPs who want to unravel Brexit and Labour constituencies, not least in, say, the northeast of England, where Tony Blair's Sedgefield constituency was, which were vehemently in favour of Brexit. That's your dilemma.
I think what people were sold during the Brexit referendum was a simplistic answer to their concerns about immigration.
What, they were too stupid to work it out for themselves?
No, they were told that there would be strong controls on immigration. They have no sign of that in sight. The government could do more on that now. And as Tony has said, you can take strong policy measures even at the moment, and you can go out and renegotiate freedom of movement in other European capitals. Instead, we've set ourselves on a path to to cut off our relationship with our closest trading nation, trading partner, to make ourselves poorer. And there is no deal that the government can do that will make up for the loss of economic activity with our closest trading partner. So we're spending £50 billion to leave the EU and to make ourselves poorer. And he's right to say that when that happens, people have the right to look again and see, is that what they were promised during the referendum? It isn't. They were promised controls on immigration and more money for the NHS. And looking at the state of the NHS today, that promise has been broken with shattering and devastating consequences.
On your point about the single market, was the European Commission lying when they said you can't have membership of the single union and free move and remove yourself from free movement of people? The two things are absolutely fundamental pillars of the entire EU project.
They're right to say that freedom of movement is a fundamental pillar, but where I think the Conservatives have painted a sort of a European bogeyman is to say, well, these immigrants are coming over here, they're sort of scrounging on benefits, they're clogging up our hospitals, they're filling up our schools.
Which senior Conservatives have said that?
Well, that was the whole rhetoric of the Leave campaign, was about the pressure on public services. The pressure on public services has been caused by 7 years of reorganisation and underfunding by the Conservative Party. As usual, they've got a scapegoat to blame somebody else for that. It's either benefit scroungers or it's hard-working immigrants. In a way, you can't have an immigrant who's scrounging on benefits and at the same time working really hard to keep our NHS and our social care services going. So, you know, there's this sort of, it'll all be easier if we leave the EU. The reality is that the Conservatives' negotiations with our European partners and trading partners before Christmas was chaotic at best. Was highly damaging. We've had 3 cabinet resignations and we've got a government that is incredibly weak. We need to be taking a stance against what the Conservatives are doing with Brexit. It's taking up all the bandwidth and they're napping on the job when it comes to improving public services, improving security and funding our police properly as well.
And you'd like to see a second referendum?
What I would like to see, we're going to have a significant, meaningful vote in Parliament on the terms of the deal. The Conservatives had to be dragged kicking and screaming into that. We're going to see the report bill coming. It's up to the public then to decide if a vote in Parliament is adequate or whether they want to express their views one more time. And I think that is a question that is open. But I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the year we see another form of plebiscite, whether that's a general election or a referendum. It wouldn't surprise me, given the chaos that the government is starting the year under.
Mary Cray, thanks very much.
Well, joining us to discuss, Geraint Davies, Labour MP for Swansea West, and Kwasi Kwarteng, Conservative MP for Spelthorne. Thank you both very much for joining us. Geraint, to you first. Is Jeremy Corbyn wrong, then, on the Brexit policy for the Labour Party?
Well, no, I think increasingly the party's pointing out what the people are saying, that this isn't what people voted for. We're calling for being part of the customs union, the single market, of the money we're promised for the NHS. None of those things are materialising. We're saying that we should be taking back control, but instead the current bill, Clause 9, gives ministers sweeping powers to strike out protections and rights we get from the EU. This isn't what people voted for, and my view is that people should have the final say. They voted in principle to leave. If they're not served up what they were promised, they should have the right to stay.
It's a muddled message, though, isn't it, Geraint? And that's what Tony Blair's saying, that Jeremy Corbyn isn't providing a clear enough message to the population of how the whole Labour Party feels and of what steps can be taken.
Well, Tony Blair's helpful point is that the economy is going to pot. People were told they get £350 million a week for the NHS. They're losing £350 million a week. On top of that, they'll pay for the divorce bill. On top of that, they pay inflation. So people should have the final say on whether what they're served up, what they were promised. As regards his side comments about the Labour Party, obviously they're not helpful. The Labour Party is putting amendments down to the current bill, which is woefully useless in the sense that Parliament is losing its power and the people lose their right to environmental protection and other rights. Okay. So it's a long game. My personal position, as you know, is I'm calling outright for a referendum on the final say. So people have voted in principle to leave. If they don't like what they get, it doesn't resemble what they were promised, they should have a second vote. And on that, I agree with Tony Blair.
Kwasi Kwarteng, what's to fear about that? Theresa May negotiates the deal. She keeps all the Brexiteers and the Conservative Party happy. It's a good deal for the country, apparently. What's there to fear about that then going to a national referendum?
I don't think there's anything to fear. I mean, from my point of view, a personal point of view, I would have nothing to fear because I suspect strongly that the result would be confirmed. I think the people who think they want to get back into the EU and think that it's a disaster to leave the EU are mistaken in thinking that a second referendum will necessarily reverse that. Now, as far as Tony Blair is concerned, I find it extraordinary that a man who voluntarily left Parliament more than 10 years ago, he went off and made many millions, reportedly. He's left politics, has now come back and from on high is telling not only what the Labour Party should be doing, but also what the country should be doing.
He hasn't entirely left politics, has he?
Essentially, well, he's not elected to anything.
He's still working, you know, on the Middle East peace process, and sometimes being apart from something gives you perspective, doesn't it?
Well, forgive me, he has no electoral mandate. He was an MP for 24 years. He voluntarily left the House of Commons to pursue his own commercial interests, and I have no problem with that. And now has decided that the 17.4 million people, 17.4 million, far more than he ever received in a general election, have all got it wrong, and that we should now have a second referendum, essentially to reverse the result of the first referendum, and that somehow we will manage magically to stay in the EU. I think this is pure fantasy. I think also we should look at the real progress that the government has made. Many people were saying that we wouldn't get to the second stage of talks. That has been done. The money was supposed to be insurmountable, but that's been agreed. And I think most people in the country want to see Brexit delivered. I think they feel that we're on the right track, and that all the fears and the doom-mongering from 18 months ago simply hasn't materialised. I mean, Geraint was saying how dismal everything is. Frankly, we've had 6 quarters of growth since the referendum. The stock market is at a historic high, and I know there are problems. I mean, clearly there's always uncertainty, but generally the outlook is much better than the doom-mongers suggested 18 months ago. No, the outlook is much better. It is a fact, forgive me, that the FTSE 100 is at all-time highs. That's a fact.
That's a fact, but what we don't know is whether it would have been like that despite Brexit, whether we hadn't voted for Brexit, do we? Nobody can predict what the future could have been like.
Can I come back to you on this? Because, well, they did predict it. I mean, you will remember that in the course of the campaign, various people, George Osborne included, were saying that there would be a recession in 2016. That mercifully didn't happen. They also said that we would lose 500,000 jobs. And as I last looked, we're in the best, we're having essentially almost full employment, and the employment figures are better than they have been for 45 years. So clearly, some people did make predictions which have been falsified. I'm not saying that the outlook is universally rosy. I think there are still uncertainties, but where we are today, at the beginning of 2018, is much better. A much better place than many predicted, certainly on the Remain side last year.
Geraint Davis, do you not think that there is something morally questionable about suggesting a second referendum when a referendum has been held, the country voted in large numbers and the country decided? It was close, but they did decide. Do you not feel as a politician that when voters decide something, that you must listen to them rather than just say, hang on, I want another referendum, it didn't go my way?
I understand what you're saying. Basically, I accept that people voted in principle to leave, and on the basis of various promises about having market access, having more money and taking back control. And they now found they're not getting any of those things. And that's why 50% of people want a second referendum and only a third don't. And that's why 51% of people want to remain now in the EU and 41% don't. So what's happened is people have changed their mind based on the facts as they have emerged. whether it's inflation, whether it's the fact we're the lowest growth rate, whether it's the fact they've got insecure jobs, they voted to leave, not leave their jobs. Whatever it is, the majority of people now want to remain, and the majority of people want a referendum on the exit package. They didn't see the exit package. They accepted in principle that we were looking at leaving. We are looking at leaving, and what we see is a complete disaster. But ultimately, it's not for me and other parliamentary colleagues to decide this. It's up to the people, finally, on this massive issue that will affect countless generations in the future, to make a final decision, a final say on the table. Because as Keynes said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? And the facts have changed. That's all. And as regards Tony Blair, it doesn't really matter. Obviously, lots of people don't like Tony Blair because he's made money or whatever it is. That's irrelevant. We are now talking about whether people should have the final say, and they clearly should do. And it's a matter of democracy that they should have that final say. It shouldn't be decided in darkened rooms that they just served up whatever David Davis can scrape off the floor. It's simply not good enough.
Well, let's put those points to Kwasi Kwarteng. I mean, do you hold any weight by that? Just, you know, the fact that people did vote for lots of things that they were concerned about, things like immigration, things like pressure on the NHS that we're hearing about today. These are all issues that people felt very passionately about. They maybe thought that Brexit was the solution to these problems, but what if it isn't? And shouldn't they now be offered a chance to vote on this final package?
OK, let me be very clear. For 30 years and more, we've debated the European issue. It was decided by 5/6 of the House of Commons, went through Parliament, that we should have a referendum that would settle the issue once and for all. That referendum took place. More people voted in that election than in any British election in history. 17.4 million, which was the largest number for any particular side in any election in British history, voted to leave the EU. Now, I understand that people are very disappointed. Some people still are very disappointed about the result, and they want to refight it, and they think that somehow a massive calamity has befallen the country. I think that, forgive me for, I didn't interrupt you, and I wish you'd extend the same courtesy. I think many people, most people in fact, just want to get on. They want to get on with their lives. They want this process to be, to reach its conclusion. The government is in a much better place with regard to the negotiations than we thought possible a few months ago. It looks like the EU are cooperating and that we will reach a deal. There's a great deal of confidence about that. And we just want to see the process through. This idea of having a second referendum or a never-endum simply to get the result that you want, I don't think really squares with democracy. As I understand, many Labour MPs voted to follow the referendum, to have a referendum, and I think we should abide by the result.
OK, we're out of time, I'm afraid. I know you very, very briefly. Do you want to come back, Geraint, very, very briefly?
Well, I mean, the great majority of MPs know in the heart of hearts we shouldn't be leaving. And I think it's irresponsible not to give people the final say. They're sort of all biting their lips. Obviously, people voted on a pack of lies, whether it was money, taking back control, or being access to the single market. They haven't got what they were promised. The people deserve a final say on this. It's absolutely disgraceful that we should move ahead in this sort of way.
OK, Geraint Davis, Labour for Swansea West, and Kwasi Kwarteng, Conservative MP. Thank you both very much.
It is hard to recall the days when Tony Blair bestrode the world, or at least British politics, but I suppose you have to give him some credit for still plugging away in public life. For the moment, he is trying to unpick recent history. He's pushing again for another vote on Brexit, and more than that, he is criticising his own party's position for not sufficiently challenging the government's handling of the issue.
He's won more elections than any other Labour leader. 3 victories, but 1 catastrophe. Foreign policy might have lost Tony Blair the ear of his party, but today he was still trying to bend it, calling for Labour to offer a second say on Brexit.
We know a lot more now than we did back then. We know, for example, that the money is not going to come into the health service. We know that our economic growth is down. You know, we know that our currency is down. So, you know, I'm saying we should have the right to rethink. Doesn't mean to say we will come to a different decision, but we should at least have the right to rethink.
You can pick and choose your economic arguments, but public opinion is not shifting.
You can pick and choose your economic arguments, that's absolutely true, but what you can't dispute, because even the government now accepts it, is that growth is lower as a result of Brexit. That's less revenue for the country.
Those arguments were made, though, during the referendum campaign. People accepted the arguments, they voted leave. That surely is said and done.
Yeah, but back then in June 2016, you can make claims and counterclaims, right? You now got 18 months of fact. Okay, so you can see what's actually happened. What you can't possibly have known in June 2016 is the new relationship. Now we're going to see it. I find it almost strange that what is, I would have thought, plain British common sense, namely when you see the full picture, you're entitled to a rethink, that this is regarded as somehow sort of treasonous or treacherous.
But you are speaking as if you have huge sway over the Labour Party, when actually you're a figure of contempt among Jeremy Corbyn's wing of the party quite often.
Yeah, that's true.
Are they going to listen to you?
Maybe, maybe not. Of course, I know there will be a lot of people criticising me for intervening on this at all, but you know, my attitude is, look, it's a free country. I've got a right to speak. People have got a right to listen or not, as they like.
Have you spoken to Jeremy Corbyn before making this intervention today?
No, I mean, we don't...
Is that helpful? Is that helpful to make an intervention without speaking to the leader of your own party?
I don't know whether it's helpful or not. He and I have a profound disagreement about this. What he thinks it's best to do is to carry through Brexit, right? And what I'm trying to say to people like him and others in the Labour Party is, if you carry on with this Brexit business, you'll be in the same position as the Tory party. You're not going to be able to be spending your time on the health service over the next few years if you win an election, become a government. You're going to be spending your time, as this government is spending its time, on Brexit from the moment you wake up in the morning to the moment you go to sleep at night.
More than anyone in Labour, he knows the challenges of power, but he now wields very little of it when it comes to party policy.
And Paul is here now. He didn't quite say he didn't care what Jeremy Corbyn thought, did he? But nearly. Does Mr Corbyn in any way care what Tony Blair's got to say on this matter?
I wouldn't think so, Tom. In fact, I asked his team today, is there any response at all to Tony Blair's comments? Got one word back. No, which I'm pretty much interpreting as an eye roll from Jeremy Corbyn on his Mexican holiday. We know that Corbynistas, Corbynites, define themselves in opposition, really, to Blairites, don't they? So I don't think in any way they care, really, what Tony Blair thinks about foreign policy. In fact, the Shadow Health Secretary, John Ashworth, said to us today, politicians have to be very careful telling people that the way they voted is wrong. In other words, Labour ain't going to be promising a second referendum anytime soon. That's not to say that nobody in Labour takes encouragement from Tony Blair's views today. In fact, I spoke recently to one Shadow Cabinet member who said they would quite like Labour to move towards a Remain position if there is appetite for it. There is a poll out today showing 78% of Labour members would like a second referendum. That is members, not voters, and those two can be very different things, of course. And look, the Lib Dems, didn't they, in the general election offered this pledge of a second referendum, didn't go too great for them. My sense is Labour's opinion officially will only move if public opinion moves.
OK, well, let us see, Paul. Thank you very much indeed.